In this roundup of a busy week, a new report suggests that the last year, and indeed the last decade, were among the warmest ever recorded. And if you dispute that, at least one campaign group says that you shouldn't be heard on YouTube. The police label Extinction Rebellion as an extremist, then quickly backtrack, and Microsoft and Blackrock set new levels of ambition for transforming businesses in the face of climate change. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Lots to get through this week, and I warn you now, it might just get a bit ranty. First off, the UK's Met Office has released global temperature figures suggesting that the last decade was the warmest on record. Interestingly, it noted in its own press release that NASA and NOAA had actually positioned the most recent decades as the second warmest. All three of the datasets agree that the last 5 years were the warmest 5-year period since records began, and the Met Office suggested that the differences between them on the decade time period comes from the fact that they deal differently with the way that data-sparse polar regions are handled. NASA also noted that the amount of heat absorbed by the world's oceans hit a new high in 2019, which it said contributed to rising sea levels and melting ice sheets. Dr. Colin Morris of the Met Office Hadley Centre said, "Our collective global temperature figures agree that 2019 joins the other years from 2015 as the 5 warmest years on record." He added, "While we expect global mean temperatures to continue to increase in general, we don't expect to see year-on-year increases because of the influence of natural variability in the climate system." Obviously, when that happens, some of the critics will pounce and start saying that temperatures are going down. This proves that all of the climate alarmists are wrong. And you'll see some of them doing just that if they're looking at just the US figures right now. But will they still be doing it on YouTube? A campaign group, Avaz, has launched a report slamming YouTube for allowing ads to be run against videos that it says promote disinformation about climate change. Why is YouTube broadcasting climate misinformation to millions? It thundered. Basically, for this slightly less than extensively researched report, they did a couple of searches on climate change related terms on YouTube, counted how many of the results were videos that were on the skeptic side, saw which one of those had ads running against them and noted down which companies were running those ads, and also noted what videos were in the recommended videos to play next. And they contacted a bunch of the advertisers and asked if they were aware that their ads were running against these dreadful videos, and so on. Videos that they identified included several run by PragerU, featuring folks like Piers Corbyn, Richard Lindzen, Patrick Moore, the familiar list of characters. YouTube already gives advertisers the ability to opt out of having their ads played against videos that feature the issue of climate change at all, which seems fair enough. But it doesn't give you the option to only opt out of appearing against the wrong kind of climate change videos featuring misinformation and bad thoughts. The organisation has 4 demands on YouTube. 1. Detox YouTube's algorithms. The company must end its free promotion of misinformation and disinformation videos by extracting such videos from its recommendation algorithms. In other words, you can publish your videos into the void, but no one's going to be discovering any of them unless they're already subscribed to your channel, because they won't appear on any recommendations for anybody. 2. Demonetize misinformation and disinformation, so such videos can't have ads run against them, whether the advertisers are happy with the placement or not. 3. Correct the record. Work with independent fact-checkers to inform users who have seen or interacted with verifiably false or misleading information and issue corrections alongside these videos. 4. Transparency. The company should reveal how many views of misinformation videos have been viewed driven by its recommendation engines, and then the CEO should receive as many lashes as that in a public flogging. Alright, I made the last bit up, but you know they would if they could. And they suggest YouTube should overlay videos that contain bad thoughts with a box like this one. You have to click away before you can view the dangerous content. Imagine how well that will go down with large chunks of the American audience. Now, I've done a number of videos critiquing climate skeptical videos on this channel. I put time and thought into engaging with facts and research and arguments and ideas, which is how I think differences should be addressed. You know, free speech, the answer to the downsides of free speech, where they even occur, is more free speech. But of course, they're not arguing that you can't have free speech, just that you shouldn't be able to attract an audience for the wrong kind of free speech. You shouldn't be able to get any kind of income that helps you produce that content, and people shouldn't be able to see it without actively hacking through the undergrowth with a machete in order to find it. I think some of the videos they've highlighted make really poor arguments, not good videos, but I think this campaign proposition is worse than any alleged evil it attempts to address. It's campaigners wanting to impose their version of what you are and aren't allowed to think on any medium. We've seen it when Extinction Rebellion protest outside the BBC, suggesting they're not talking enough about climate change, which is pretty staggering because the BBC seems to talk about little else. And we see it here now with attempts to impose one version of reality on a debate on a platform like YouTube. And of course, even if you decided that you might think the idea at its heart had some merit, which it doesn't, but let's supposing that you did, the question then goes, well, who decides? And on what basis? Climate change is an umbrella term for a whole lot of different issues and processes. If you feature Roger Hallam saying that 6 billion people will die in the next few decades, is that allowed under your new system? I mean, most scientists will confirm that that is disinformation. Is it the sort of disinformation you had in mind? What about if you do a video pointing out that Roger Hallam was wrong to say that? Is that okay? Or is that going to be mistaken for a dreadful denier video? What about if you include links to lots of scientific papers backing up your argument? Is YouTube going to employ an expert to read all those papers and then decide whether you got your facts right or not? What about if you say you completely accept the science of climate change, but you completely disagree with radical public policy to tackle it? Which side of the line does that fall on? Fair public debate or dreadful misinformation? What if a group of scientists publish a peer-reviewed study in a mainstream journal contesting a key part of the current orthodox wisdom and people make videos discussing it or even promoting it? Is that one over the line? If you look at their report, they'd say, but we know the really egregious stuff and we don't want to stop fair debate. We just want to stop the denier disinformation. The question still remains, where do you draw the line? Because as soon as you've defined it, the location of that line will be tested to destruction. Now, obviously I have an interest here. I would like this channel to grow sufficiently that I could spend all my time creating content, because some of you seem to find it of value and I enjoy creating it. I would say that I try to stick more closely to the science on this channel than most. It's certainly the plan, but then of course that's what they all say. Fans of Tony Heller will say, oh yes, that Mallen, he's a dreadful climate alarmist. It's not what the other side say. Like this comment I had on one of my videos just yesterday. This entire channel is about undermining the science of climate change while attempting to look more reasonable. Sorry, no. That's like being a moderate Nazi, one who only wanted to kill 2 million instead of 6 million Jews. I reasonably responded that I didn't quite think that he was the master of the topic of what this channel was about. It's a subject you might expect me to have some knowledge about after all, but oh no, because this man has a PhD. I'm a doctor of political science. I'm very familiar with what this channel is trying to do. An attempt to look more moderate than the craziest of the craziest is not a new tactic. When one looks at the content of this channel, it's clear as to the agenda. Its entire focus is an attempt to discredit man-made climate change. There is no balance here. Well, I hope all those Tony Heller fans who come to my channel are paying attention. I mean, you may have all swarmed my Heller critique videos thinking I was some dreadful climate alarmist, but now you know that that was wrong, because a man with a PhD says so. All along, it was really a subtle ploy to undermine man-made climate change by defending it against Tony Heller. It's a genius plot, so subtle, so nefarious. At first glance, it looks like it makes no sense at all. But that's because you need a PhD in political science to sniff it out. Ah, curses! Foiled again. And I'd have got away with it too if it hadn't been for these damn PhDs. You get my point. Who decides? As far as this person is concerned, there are two types. People who think exactly like him, and then wrong people. Are those the people who get to decide who can and who can't get to be a creator on YouTube? On a practical level, YouTube knows full well what a poison chalice it's being offered. And, they've grappled more than people will give them credit for on how to manage a very difficult balance in this sort of area. I don't expect them to actually cave into such demands. The best the campaigners will achieve, and they may well achieve this, is to worry and harass advertisers so they decide to stay away from any content on the subject at all. And that, of course, will then impact the creators that the campaigners would actually want to support. Which might include me. Definitely not if Extinction Rebellion and Mr. PhD have their way. But there are certainly popular creators that they would want to support that would then not be able to make it work for them. On the one hand, you get Extinction Rebellion outside the BBC saying you've got to cover climate change more. And then on the other hand, you've got campaigners of the same ilk, as we have here, whose demands would probably lead to less climate change content from anybody on YouTube except for the mainstream news media on the platform at all. Hilarious though it might be to see the unintended consequences of that scale coming from yet another misconceived campaign pitch, I just think it's wrong. I don't care if we agree or not on an issue. Don't try to create systems that you're not prepared to have used against you. It's just common sense. This PhD, alleged, decided that I must be a climate denier because I stood up for free speech of sceptics in the debate of who should and should not be invited onto the BBC. That was the video that he was commenting on. Because in the world of the campaigners, nobody stands up for free speech unless it's one of your own side who's being denied a platform. Which is exactly why you don't put any of those people in charge of the mechanisms of free speech. And before anyone says it, of course, YouTube is a private company. It doesn't have to provide free speech. But given what it tries to do in the world, its corporate mission, the version that would have it approve only content that fits an establishment orthodoxy, that would pretty much kill it as a platform in a super quick time. And they know that. And the campaigners should really pay attention to these arguments because during the last week, there was at least a minor kerfuffle about whether or not Extinction Rebellion should be classified as an extremist organisation or not. And surely the first thing that would happen to an organisation officially classified as an extremist organisation is that YouTube and Facebook would take their pages down. That's what you do with extremists, right? Think about it, let it sink in. The story came when British counter-terrorism police did a limited distribution of a document that included Extinction Rebellion with a list of extremist ideologies that should be reported to the police. This was part of the government's Prevent programme, which aims to catch those likely to commit terrorist atrocities before they act by encouraging officials to report people who they think are acting suspiciously. And that put XR alongside neo-Nazi terrorist groups and pro-terrorist Islam groups. Now, of course, this was quickly and roundly ridiculed, and the embarrassed police quickly backtracked, said it had only been circulated on a limited basis and would be recalled. That said, Home Secretary Priti Patel said that although XR was just a protest organisation, police were right to keep them under surveillance. Didn't say it should be classified as a terrorist organisation, but it should be kept a watch on. And that was taken by some as a dreadful right-wing police state reaction to a completely harmless protest group of middle-class hippies. And of course, there's no doubt that it was disproportionate as things stand today to put XR alongside actual violent terrorist organisations. But you can't have it always. The movement was created by founders who explicitly stated at the time that the objective was to bring down the regime. Now, it feels as though that time may have passed, that those founders are not fully in control. It feels that way a bit right now. But how do the authorities know if they don't keep an eye on what's going on? An offshoot of the group decided it wasn't radical enough and tried to fly drones at airports. Now, it was a weak symbolic gesture in that case, But if people believe the group's own rhetoric, it is absolutely the potential breeding ground for someone to decide that they need to do something more dramatic. In my very first video on the group, I predicted that at some point in the future there would be a more radical offshoot as people sold on the rhetoric of near-term human extinction would follow that belief through to its logical conclusion. And particularly as the group failed to achieve its goals, they'd conclude, oh, all this non-violent stuff isn't working, time for something more dramatic. So of course the police should be monitoring a group that tells children they're going to die young, as Rupert Read does in his talks. That's exactly the sort of radicalisation process that creates extremists, or at the very least a lot of seriously disturbed children. And indeed, in an article published this week, Rupert Read acknowledged that the group's impossible aims to get to zero carbon by 2025 are now definitely impossible because of the election of the Boris Johnson government. He said this: "Here in the UK, the party with by far the worst rankings of its climate policies, so bad that its leader preferred to be represented by a melting piece of ice rather than defend Conservative policies in live televised debate, has been handed electoral victory and a landslide 80-seat majority." There's no acknowledgement there that the Conservative policies are for net zero carbon by 2050, the most radical plan of any previously elected government, and currently the most radical plan of any country of a similar size and economy in the world. And incidentally, the same plan that is shared by the EU, which this week announced a full quarter of its budget would be spent getting the continent to match that commitment. The cash needed principally because some of the Eastern European countries that are currently heavily invested in coal. But no, none of that from Rupert. Just a message about how now that's happened, we're all definitely doomed because the fate of the entire world was hanging on that election in the UK. Who knew? Painfully, we have to admit to ourselves that the 2025 deadline of net zero carbon emissions and biodiversity loss, perhaps our best known of the three demands, has suddenly become almost unachievable, barring a very risky and improbable notion of some kind of seizure of power from the current government. Risky, improbable, and also immoral and anti-democratic, Rupert. Don't forget those parts. But the reality we now face probably makes it too late to stop this civilization from ending during the next generation or two at the most. We must start thinking seriously and realistically about the possibility of society being likely to decline or even collapse. So this is now what Rupert and many of his friends will be preaching. When they call on the BBC and YouTube to tell the truth, that's what they think the truth is, even though it's not supported by the mainstream science, as was pointed out to Rupert by numerous climate scientists some months ago in his Twitter route. Bear in mind as well, they won't even contemplate supporting nuclear power. They won't even contemplate supporting genetic modification. No suggestion these might be lesser evils than watching society collapse. It's not an entirely coherent worldview. It's all very well saying that this is a group of harmless hippies who are protesting in good faith to save us all from disaster, but such protest movements in the past did not seek to overthrow the state, they sought to spur it to action. If you've failed to distance yourself from that original statement of intent, and if you radicalise people by exaggerating and misrepresenting the science, and you do that with young children specifically, then yes, the police should be keeping an eye on you because you're treading a dangerous line. Please, to all of the good people in XR who joined just because they care about climate change, don't follow the path that Rupert Read is mapping out for you. As I've said before, when bad consequences follow, you will all throw your hands up and saying, how terrible, whoever could have predicted that would happen. Maybe one or two people will remember that there was some old git who, mentioned it in passing once or twice before they managed to get him booted off YouTube. Let's be honest, probably not. While Rupert and his friends are wringing their hands and preparing for the apocalypse, fortunately, some people are getting on with practical action. Microsoft announced this week that it would be aiming to remove its entire historical carbon footprint from the atmosphere. Not only would it become carbon zero in terms of its current emissions, but it would invest in developing the new technologies needed to remove from the atmosphere its contribution of CO2 since it was first founded back in 1975. It aims to become carbon negative by 2030, so within 10 years, taking out more than it puts in, and to remove its historical input by 2050. That's obviously a pretty astonishing and far-reaching ambition. And while people like Rupert dismiss the possibility of technology that can remove some of the excess of CO2 from the atmosphere because it's unproven, which means you don't even try apparently, obviously Microsoft, which is used to seeing the power of innovation and understands that when you set out to crack a problem, usually you can do it, it's made a bet on its own ability and its own impact. Good for them. Because even if you're one of the climate critics that do currently exist, if successful businesses can pave their way to still being successful and solving emissions problems, why wouldn't you support it? And obviously, whatever the companies promise, the campaigners will always say, yeah, but in this case, it was Greenpeace who sort of welcomed it and then added, yeah, but Microsoft still has some relationship with oil and gas companies. Well, maybe it does. And if every single thing connected with the current oil and gas industry was severed tomorrow, you would throw the world into chaos. Large numbers of people thrown into poverty. Bang goes any hope of an orderly transition to a more sustainable economy. Microsoft's action was then boosted further with the annual letter to shareholders of the chief executive of BlackRock. BlackRock is the huge investment firm with $7 trillion of investment. In the letter, CEO Larry Fink said that in the future, climate change would be at the heart of the company's investment strategy. Climate change risk would drive what he described as a fundamental reshaping of finance. And he said that would include a reallocation of capital sooner than most anticipate. Our investment conviction is that sustainability and climate-integrated portfolios can provide better risk-adjusted returns to investors, he said. And with the impact of sustainability on investment returns increasing, we believe that sustainable investing is the strongest foundation for client portfolios going forward. And he added, where we feel that companies and boards are not producing effective sustainability disclosures or implementing frameworks for managing these issues, we will hold board members accountable. And of course, Extinction Rebellion said that it wasn't enough. They released a statement to say, it's not always the case that something is better than nothing, particularly if it's used to distract from the truth. And the truth is that the world's biggest miners and polluters will not be losing any sleep over this. BlackRock can rest assured that we will continue to pile on the pressure until they act to protect our children and the natural world. That's unless in the meantime they listen to Rupert and decide it's too late and decide to go off instead and prepare for the apocalypse within the next couple of generations. Of course, it's historically been the influence of investors pushing businesses to look only towards the short-term returns that's been part of the problem in business. And not just in relation to sustainability, but good management overall. The shift of some mainstream investors, not the ethical niche players, the mainstream investors to begin to look at longer term risks and factor those in is going to add to the pressure for more companies to follow the lead of Microsoft and to look rationally at how they can be financially successful in the long term in a rapidly changing world. Therein lies some of our best hopes of progress. Because, as the UK election showed, given the choice, people will reject the vision of environmentalism that is about slamming on the brakes and reducing human progress. So, we are all in for building prosperity while dealing with the unintended consequences of our success. That's the plan. Doesn't it feel like something that's worth the attempt? Let's leave that question hanging in the air. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.